Okay. So good morning. This is session 3 of Reading More Barth Together, where Will Willimon and Stanley Hauerwas read Barth for our benefit. So just a few logistical points. Today we'll be covering the last essay in The Humanity of God, the gift of freedom. And Stan and Will talk about that for about 45 minutes. And then we'll move to a Q&A time. So if you do have questions, and I hope you do, make sure to drop those in the Q&A. Seeing that some folks have been using the chat this morning, but I won't be checking that. So make sure to put those in the Q&A instead. And as you're going through, if you can also pay attention to the Q&A and hit like and upvote them, then I'll keep an eye on that and use that to kind of help select which questions we talk about towards the end. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to y'all.
I think that this is probably the most disappointing chapter in the humanity of God. And you feel a kind of abstractness after the second chapter on the humanity of God. And you wonder why the focus so strongly on freedom as the central concept. And the influence of Kant is still working in Barth. And part of what he's trying to do is it's what is oftentimes called meta-ethics. He's trying to establish the possibility of the moral life, not give an account of the moral life in and of itself. And he's doing that by emphasizing freedom as the very character of God's gift to the human to be, to have as our one telos, obedience to God's commands. And the language of commands is very important for Barth in that regard.
Yeah, I like your point about he wants to establish the possibility of human ethical action, freedom, because how do you rise above the determinism that seems to be one of the discoveries and one of the or unacknowledged realities of modern life? It seems so kind of modern for Barth to say, I'm going to talk about ethics and then mainly talk about freedom.
When he came to America, he said if he were an American theologian, he would structure his theology around freedom, because that is what America was allegedly about. He didn't mean he would underwrite the American understanding of freedom, namely, freedom is when you get to do what you want to do, even if you didn't know what it was you wanted to do. For Barth, freedom is, as he says clearly, determinatively a gift. And now, if you think about the language of gift in contradistinction with the language of freedom, most people think that gift and freedom are in tension, because if your ability to act depends upon freedom being given to you, then the very fact that you've had to accept a gift means you're not free. So for what Barth is doing in this essay is not unlike Kant, trying to show that genuine freedom is non-causal In other words, it was not caused by anything other for Kant than our own self-will, but for Barth, God's gracious act of giving.
Yeah, human freedom can be discussed because of God's freedom,
Right.
and God's freedom is the freedom of God to be for humanity. That is the essence of God's sovereignty, is God's turning toward humanity. And yeah.
There's this wonderful sentence on 72. The concept of God without man is indeed as anomalous as wood and iron. You remember, we got that phrase wood and iron also as a description of systematic theology and the nature of doctrine.
Yeah. And he is carrying through a theme that he began the humanity of God with, that God, we suppose that God's freedom was God's freedom to be from, to turn away from humanity, to be qualitatively different than humanity. And yet Barth says God is free for humanity, and that kind, in the same way human freedom is the ability to be for God. And he also talks about for others. He talks about how we must turn toward even the worst of humanity. That we cannot turn away from the vilest of human beings because God has not turned away from humanity. So it always seems to me one of the problems of freedom is it's a word that demands so much qualification, it becomes almost meaningless.
Well, it's freedom is perfect obedience. So it's when you can.
But to say that is to go against 9/10 of definitions of freedom.
Well,
what do you think?
That's true. It's on 75 where it says God in his own freedom bestows human freedom. Here we must point to so-called natural freedom, which constitutes and characterizes human existence in its creatureness, and to the freedom of eternal life promised to man. Here for once we must daringly include both in what is being said about Christian freedom and so on. So Christian freedom frees natural freedom in a way that otherwise it couldn't be free.
Mm-hmm. Do you, how is this the central thing Barth needs to talk about when he talks about ethics? Like, one might have thought he would speak of obedience or responsive. I mean, it's kind of a jolt that Barth would think that when he's talking about ethics, he's got to talk about freedom,
Well,
mostly.
It is to underwrite the centrality of God's command as the mark of what makes ethics possible. And God's command, I mean, in 3:4, he makes the polemical attack upon casuistry and says that while you can presume that, for example, the Decalogue will give you generalizations of what is to be done, but you can never anticipate how you must always, first of all, respond to God's command in a way that means casuistical reflection doesn't trump what God commands. So there's always a kind of an attack upon what might be thought of as ordinary moral life in Barth. That doesn't.
Yeah, which he would see sometimes ordinary moral life as just another human attempt to delimit God. To here is the good godly thing like to do would dangerously limit the freedom of God. Or
in 3:4, it's oftentimes missed that it's framed by the Sabbath, and I think there's just brilliant stuff there that many people miss. But I wanted to read a passage from 3:4 that gives you a sense of the radicalness of Barth's ethics. It's in the section on man, woman, and it's about marriage. He says, a final observation may be made in connection with what was said at the beginning of this discussion about monogamy as an institution. On the mission field, the Christian church, and therefore theological ethics, is continually faced by polygamy. We can leave on one side the historical question whether this is to be understood as original, whatever that may mean, or as a product of ethical decadency or social necessity. Polygamy is in any case an institution over wide areas. It is rooted in custom ruled by written and unwritten laws and lived out as a fact. And the possibility cannot be ruled out that it might again become an institution in other areas. Of course it has. We're not a monogamous culture, we're a serial polygamous culture. He says, now obviously this cannot alter the content of the divine command in the very slightest. And in proclaiming the latter, the Christian church must not be guilty of any deviation or suppression. That is, we are monogamous. He says, equally obviously, however, it is not to proclaim more than the divine command. Its function is not to establish, maintain, and defend one institution against another. It is not to play off European against African and Asiatic custom, jurisprudence, and practice. It cannot overlook the fact that the institution of monogamy offers not the slightest guarantee that the divine command of monogamy, which is its only concern, will be kept and not transgressed. Nor will it overlook the fact that the institution of polygamy does not make absolutely impossible the keeping of the divine command of monogamy. It may not overlook the paradoxical fact that even within a framework of polygamy, there can be marriages which are good, that are so good that they put us to shame, and which are contrary to all appearances monogamous in the sense of the divine purpose.
I think it's marvelous that after his long, belabored discussion of marriage and monogamy, he caps it off by saying, and yet polygamy is a possibility. And it has been, it's in scripture. And I also like the fact that he mentions the mission situation, the mission that in mission we encounter other cultures and all. And it does seem to me thoroughly in keeping, back to freedom. He wants to maintain God's freedom must be asserted. God is free to command. I am a God who kills and makes alive, you know. So, and to me, I wonder if, to me, at this point, Barth seems very Lutheran in that he wants to keep open. He doesn't want to do anything to curtail the possibility of bold, courageous, surprising human action. Luther's sin boldly kind of thing.
There's the famous story of when he was delivering 3-4. When he got to War and Peace, his argument for pacifism was so strong that the students were absolutely mesmerized that he would be on the side of Christian nonviolence, which he generally was. But he then, right at the end, said, but Christians, of course, cannot preclude the possibility that God will command us to go to war and this and that.
A very similar move there. You know, I would think Barth would think our problem is not rash action. Our problem is constrained, timid. I'm thinking, I was having a conversation with a group of clergy recently on race and preaching about racial issues. And I noted that these were all, liberal, forward-thinking clergy. The main reason they gave for not speaking about race was, I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't want to make a bad situation worse, or I have spoken about race and been reprimanded by African-American friends for putting it the wrong way or something. It seemed to me, Barth, I would say, but you're free. You're free to speak. You're corrigible. You're free to.
That's a really tricky matter. I've been criticized for not having written and said more about race than I have, and as the first thing I ever wrote was called The Ethics of Black Power, in which I defended the developments of Black power as the articulation of African American declaration of what they were going to do to be a people that is no longer determined by race. And it was a more or less Niebuhrian piece that said, isn't it great that African Americans are now going to learn to live without utilizing white guilt, because white guilt is so manipulative. You never know when whites will turn because they don't want to feel guilty forever. But I'd be interested in how you remember it, Will, but I remember that with the rise of Black power, one of the things that became very difficult was for white people to kind of start saying, oh yes, we're for that too. And
I remember it that way.
That was a politics of speech that made it difficult at the time to, even though you're clearly, I mean, who's not against racism? Difficult as it is to locate the complexity of racism, but it made it hard to address these matters in a way. I'm not sure Barth helps you. No.
Yeah, I remember, I don't know whether it's a Bardian moment, but I remember when the Black Panther trial was held in New Haven and we declared a strike at Yale Divinity School.
Yeah, I just,
Had you just left Yale Divinity School? Yeah.
mhm.
And I had just really arrived. And I remember we had a big meeting about what would be a proper response. Should we throw ourselves on the steps of the New Haven courthouse? Should we make a human chain around the courthouse? Right then the doors burst open and some Black Panthers burst into the room with bandoliers and machine guns. And they said, "Where were you when we were being lynched? And where were you?" And said, "We don't want you. Stay home. Keep your little white liberal selves up here in your little world." And all. Well, and then they left, and everyone was just crushed. And the next day, two of us showed up for Bard Child's Old Testament theology class, and we were talking about our dilemma that if we go down there, we're going down there white guilt, liberal atonement. If we don't go down there, we're uncaring and not in solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters. And Child said, but you're free. You're free to go, or you're free not to go. And he said, anyway, he quoted Barth as saying that so much of our ethics is a kind of an attempt to think without God, to free ourselves from being under the command of God and from the freedom of God. And so, anyway,
I've been working on a book called Becoming Human, Bardian Meditations. And one of the, I've done the last chapter simply called Race. And in it, I reproduced what I wrote 50 years ago on race. And, but I tell the story of, for when I taught the core course in Christian ethics, I began oftentimes with the Autobiography of Malcolm X, because I think it's such a stunning book.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
It's a book not just about race. No, I mean, it's obviously about, everything's about race, but it's a book that is the testimony of an extraordinary spiritual movement of an equally extraordinary man.
Mm-hmm.
And I want students to appreciate that. But in it, he tells the story. He was giving a lecture in Manhattan, and a young woman who I sounded like she mid-20s or something, was so impressed by it. She wanted to talk to him, but he was escorted out quickly and put in a taxi to go to get something to eat in Harlem. And she followed him in a taxi, and she went into the restaurant and went to the table and said, I was so impressed by your lecture. I'm ready to do anything you want me to do. And he said, we don't want you.
Yeah.
I can see, I mean, the very existence of white people at the time in those contexts would make the work of African Americans difficult.
Yeah, yeah. And he really, it seemed like he was the first that he didn't need white people to get themselves together before he was liberated. And his message to Black people was, you've been waiting a long time for white people to develop conscience and etc. And
I heard him give a speech at Hillside in New Haven when I was a student, and it just blew me away how honest and truthful he was. He said, quit letting a slave religion determine your life. Christianity is a slave religion.
mm-hmm.
Come to the true worship of the true God, Islam.
Amazing. What Stanley, his essay on freedom ends with talking about the free theologian. How did you respond to that? He lists a number of qualities, practices for the free theologian. I think the first one being you're free to be bound to Scripture.
Right. I thought that that this was it was something any person wanting to start off to be a theologian should read. Because what basically each of the ones says is, if you're going to be a theologian, enjoy it and don't apologize for it. And that you're going to have the Bible determining how you have to think. You're going to have certain philosophical positions questioned. You're going to be working within an institution called the church that may put you to shame, but you're a theologian. You got to take it seriously.
I liked his point. You got to talk to the church. In the weeks after the George Floyd killing, our Board of Church and Society, which I was surprised we still had one in the United Methodist Church, but they've been issuing kind of weekly statements on matters. And it's obvious that the Board of Church and Society is talking to America. They're not talking to the United Methodist Church, which is ironic considering we're paying all of their salaries. And but I thought, boy, that word that Barth uttered is just as needed today as always, to say, you don't have to fashion your speech and adjust your commitments that makes you able to address the whole nation. Talk to the church. And so.
What did you make, though, of his account of theology and church government?
And I'm on what page are you?
4. In the church, there are also church governments. Here in Germany, they're even embodied in bishops. They have power to speak their mighty word through pastoral letters with the framework of their own theology, which may not always be infallible. They also have the power to examine, perhaps even to institute or de-institute, certainly to recommend or withhold recommendation. Why should the free theologian not at least tolerate them as they, in their mildness and prudence, he will certainly not become their spokesman and subordinate.
I think, when it comes to church order, Barth just kind of said, it's there. But I love that way about you should theologians tolerate bishops and all in their mildness. They don't take it too seriously. Don't allow yourself to be determined by that. Maybe that's.
I think that Barth, something like Apostolic Succession, I just don't thought was very important. in terms of what was that? Was there a structure of the church that if that structure didn't exist, it wouldn't be church? I think he was pretty fast and loose on most of that.
He was. I think he notes in a number of places, I defy you to find in Scripture your basis for the ordering of your church. And I do wonder if sometimes Barth was in error in that, maybe back to the discussion of ethics, but these structures are determinative of so much. And however, he like when he talks about freedom, how do you know about freedom? How do you get freedom? You get freedom by somebody telling you you're free, by telling you God is free to be for you.
Wow.
And he has huge faith in kind of unstructural, noetic, when are you converted to Christ? Well, you're converted when somebody tells you you're converted to Christ. And just hearing that, it's wonderful for preachers, but it's a lot of faith in preaching.
But what is the image that controls how he thinks about how you know you're doing God's will? Joy. It's joy.
Mm-hmm.
And on 78 he says, and thus we can see that freedom is being joyful. Freedom is a great gift, totally unmerited and wondrous beyond understanding. It awakens the receiver to true selfhood and true life. It is a gift from God and the source of all goodness, an ever new token of his faithfulness and mercy. Now, I mean, joy is such a different concept than happiness.
Yeah.
Aristotle.
However, I am thinking, as you were talking, about a piece that our dean, Greg Jones, wrote a number of years ago. and as I remember, the title of it was Fidelity Makes You Happy.
Right.
And Greg said, you go into marriage and you think, gee, I got to keep these marriage vows. I got to limit my roaming. I've got to stay focused on this person. Well, you wake up at some point in marriage and you're not kind of keeping a promise anymore. You're just enjoying life. And that seems close to what he would say is you kind of know maybe you are doing God's will for you when there is a kind of joy. There's a dialectic that permeates this, and that the more closely bound you are to this God, the freer you are. And I think that makes his account of freedom quite different, that there is no freedom except in this bond to the God that has bound God's self to you, to humanity.
I think, I don't know exactly how to fit it into what Barth's account of freedom is, but I think we tend to think of freedom as decisions we make for the future. So we think, I always say that one of my fundamental axioms is you always marry the wrong person. And people think, oh, that's probably true. I married the wrong person the first time because I didn't know what I was doing. The second time I'll get it right. And Howard Wise's law, you always marry the wrong person, isn't a true account of every marriage, all the way down to the second and third and fourth. Because we think I didn't get it right the first time, but if I get my facts straight, I think I understand what I'm promising and so on. This time I'll get it right. I think that we think that that's freedom, that I knew what I was doing, but prospective reflection, I never knew what I was doing. You know what you were doing when you became a Methodist.
Yeah. And I think, therefore, any talk of freedom in modernity is a really conflicted undertaking. I know as a chaplain, Duke undergraduates would say, I would say to them, how did you get here? And they'd say things like, well, my father and mother really gave me a lot of freedom, and they trusted me to make good decisions for myself. And I said, well, say in your freedom you had decided to go into auto mechanics and work on automatic transmissions rather than go to Duke Divinity School, Duke University and be success. How would they have responded to that? And I remember in a sermon in Duke Chapel, I was talking about a friend of mine from India, and he and his wife met at age 12, and then they were married at age 14, and they had only seen each other maybe 15 minutes before they got married. And I said, that just seems like a crazy way to get married. However, maybe one reason that your parents are paying so much for you to come to Duke University is to be sure that you will breed with the right people. And with that, the place just exploded in laughter. But the sense, I said, maybe my Indian friend's family was much cheaper and more efficient than what your parents are having to pay to have you at Duke to marry them. So just to say that I think Christians ought to be suspicious of claims of freedom in the modern world. And if one thing the modern world has shown, it's shown our bondage. And for Barth to say the only real freedom is to be bound to the God who has bound God's self to you in freedom is a countercultural, but a deeply Christian way of thinking about it.
No, the idea that we ever really know what we're doing as the condition of freedom is a utopian presumption.
Yeah, and that was the ethics classes that I took in seminary. Behind there, it felt like there was the assumption, I am going to give you some good information on abortion. And we'll spend a week talking about abortion, and you'll know a lot about it. And therefore, you will be able to make informed decisions, intelligent decisions. And I just think Barth would say, no, that you still are acting in your servitude.
He's in his discussion of life, he deals with questions of abortion, and he is against almost all attempts to justify abortion, though he keeps, I mean, you never know what God might command, but generally, even though he says he's not doing casuistry, he's doing casuistry to give an account of abortion that is clearly judged to be wrong.
Before we leave, get into questions and all, we've mentioned Barth's Universalism before, and to me, Universalism is evoked by this chapter. And one reason Barth pushed back against any attempts to delineate the saved and the damned and the future eternal destination is that we can't do anything in any way that impugns God's freedom. God is free to love, to save whom God saves. And in Jesus Christ, God's freedom is seen most. God was in Christ reconciled. Anyway, I think, to me, the discussion over universalism often reveals ways in which we are unwilling to let God be God and to let God be free.
There is on page 84 where he says, free man is subject to God's most concrete command. For through this command, human freedom takes on authoritative form, and the imperative whereby man is confronted and measured becomes decisive. God is always man's creator, reconciler, and redeemer. That free man is subject. Subject.
Yeah.
I mean, so again, that's perfect obedience.
We are free to let God be our Redeemer and reconciler. And okay, Karsten, have we got some chatter, some questions, comments?
Yeah, to your last question, last week, Ed Fazer and David Bindley Hart got in a bit of a catfight over universalism online. And Fazer's main objection was that Hart eliminated culpability, that in believing that God would eventually save everybody, that we're letting people off the hook. They're not really treated as culpable. And it's like an eminently anti-Barthian move, that to emphasize your culpability over God's grace is to try to forget that God is God and you are not.
Who was David having a debate with?
Ed Fazer.
I don't know who that is.
He's a Thomist philosopher, or depending on, he's pretty popular online. He's got a blog that a lot of people read.
I'm very sympathetic with David's book, and I think Barth would simply say, Christ, cross, and resurrection are final. There's nothing anyone can do to make them not a victory for our God. And that means everyone has been saved by Christ. Different lives work in different ways. But I think that universalism is a Christological move for Barth in a way that's not that different from what David's doing in his book, which I thought was well done.
Yeah, the fourth meditation in the Hart book on freedom is like kind of reiterating the same sorts of ideas of freedom that we get from Barth here, that you're only free when you're acting in accordance with your nature, which is to love God.
At the same time, Barth was reluctant to say, hey, all will be saved, or I'm a universalist, or however one phrase, because he said we must never attempt to limit God. God is free to be as God is, and to claim too much. And I think von Balthasar, in saying that Barth is basically, but for what can we legitimately hope? And I like that. It's more than a decisive, but it is a hope based on what we know of Christ. So that seems relevant to the freedom discussion.
So y'all got into marriage earlier, and we got some questions around that. Particularly, it seems ironic that Barth would be trying to defend something like a reinstitution of polygamy, given his own unfaithful marital practices. So can y'all talk a little bit about how Stanley, you mentioned at the beginning that he's doing meta ethics here rather than actually getting down to doing brass tacks. So how do you keep, if you're a free theologian, as he says, trying to think ethically, from just ending up in these rationalizing self-justifications that support just unchristian practices, like living with your secretary and your wife?
Well, that passage I read about polygamy is people assume that he was thinking about his relationship with Charlotta. And I don't know whether he was or whether he wasn't. But I think Barth I think he was cruel to Mrs. Barth. And how he understood that relationship is, I think, unjustified. It's hard to know on the inside. I think we still are waiting for that to be to have the archives illuminate what in the hell was going on with the three of them. I think it was disastrous for his family. Do you know much about it, Will?
You know, what I've read is all, but I agree with how you've characterized it, as far as I understand it. I think Karsten's point, I think it's well taken, that Barth was certainly not above specious reasoning, self-justification, a number of ways. People often point out to Barth's writing, in 3 on male and female, as being some of his most questionable writing, and not living up to his own theological commitments fully in writing about male and female in that ethics section. I guess in those moments I am reminded, though, that Barth believes it is as sinful, self-justifying, deceitful people that God has saved us. That so there are a lot of places in Barth, so I think that comes through too. Now that, of course, ever since Paul, the world has called that justification a license for bad behavior or antinomianism or lack of culpability. And I think it's good to just confess it and say, yeah. And maybe a warning to all of us. I, by the way, have an excellent marriage. As many people know, my wife is actually not in the room right now. But I think I remember Jim Wallace. He was a young man that was working with Martin Luther King, and he took off a year from college to work with King. And he said when he saw the way Martin Luther King was drawn into situations extramaritally and all, he said this was so disillusioning to him, this great man, this great hero. But then Jim said, by the grace of God, I was able to say, wow, that is so much better human being than I am. And if he can be confused on certain matters, Lord God, how confused I can get, which I think is kind of nice to, or as Luther said, we should confess our own sin and throw a mantle of charity over the sins of others. But anyway.
So to continue on the question of marriage, I wonder, it seems, so in like Gene Rogers' Sexuality in the Christian Body, he uses Barth, but then ends up moving towards talking more about how the Spirit might graft homosexual marriages into the covenant of Christian heterosexual marriage that had existed for the past, couple thousand years. Does that seem like a Barthian move to y'all? I'm curious how you would react to something like that.
Gene would like to think it is, and there's certainly good reason to read it in that way. I think Gene's made the best case there can be. It's not if it's marriage, it's not gay marriage, it's marriage. It's like if infant baptism is baptism, it's not infant, it's just baptism. So the I mean, my own position on this has, I think, developed in a way to say, well, let's give it 100 years and see how gays do. We heterosexuals haven't done very well in marriage. Let's see how the gay people want to get married. It's a great gift right now. How many people do? I just am not willing to go to the mat on this one, because it just seems to me too complex in the world in which we find ourselves.
In my own church, I'm not sure, where we move to some position where we can still be church on this issue, except I am darn sure Bart would disapprove of the discussion as it's being waged in my church by people speaking of heterosexual marriage as some kind of eternal divine decree ordinance, as the test for Christian fidelity. And on the other hand, those who argue from certain sentimental positions about love and what feels right. And I would think, back to the freedom discussion, we are free to talk about it, though. We're free to debate it. And I like Stanley's suggestion that we're free to experiment and see and keep examining and re-examining.
It's a pastoral matter. And that when gay people come to the church to say they'd like to be married, then they need to face the kind of examination that every people that come to the church say they want to be married face. I mean, can they keep promises?
Yeah, making promises. And when I've been asked about this, I said, I'm a Methodist minister. I don't know that much about the sins of gay people. I just haven't had that much interaction. But I really know a lot about the sins of straight people. Heterosexual sin is pervasive. It is widespread. It is so. Again, it does. I think it's kind of sad that Bart keeps driving me back to that. What do we know for sure? And that is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself. We know that for sure. The rest of the stuff, let's have an argument. And let's also see how lives are being lived in the light of it. Well, anyway, but.
I mean, I don't think Bart's concrete casuistry is always as faithful as one would like, but he says on 87, in addition, ethical reflection may and must consult the Christian community in its past and present history. It must do this in order to be admonished, nourished, enriched, perhaps also stirred and warmed by the use of which the fathers and brethren made and still are making of Christian freedom. I mean, that's very important, and that's oftentimes skipped over.
That's excellent, relevant quote.
Like the bit in there too where he talks about forgiving our fellow theologians their sins and hoping they forgive us.
Right.
I think that's that hermeneutic of charity that really allows you to read the fathers well.
Right.
Could you all talk a little bit before we close about just using the word freedom, where you've kind of pointed out throughout this whole discussion how different like a Christian or a Barthian idea of freedom is from the way that we as Americans have been trained to use the word. So like in a sermon, how would you use the word freedom?
I rarely do.
Would you qualify it to be able to?
I rarely do. I mean, my kind of claim, I mean, people get namely that people believe today they should have no story except the story they chose when they had no story. They think that's freedom. Namely that you've made up your life on your own terms. That means you've forgotten who's telling you how to live. So exactly what I try to do is re-narrate how people understand freedom in my terms.
Yeah, I think I'm reluctant to use freedom, just like I never use affirmation or Sabbath or other words that have been corrupted. And I think maybe that's probably my dis-ease with this last concluding essay, that I think Barth he's waded into the lion's den of all people to strut around bragging about how free we are, Americans. You know, we're not free to solve our pandemic problem. We're not free. And so I would be very reluctant to use the word freedom, just like I'm reluctant to use the word experience in a sermon, because I think it requires, and I had said to Stanley, philosophically even, although Stanley says I am incapable of thinking that way, philosophically, by the time a philosopher gets through talking about freedom, I think, gee, there's no such thing as freedom. Or you've had to, and maybe just close, since Stanley mentioned Malcolm X. When I was interviewing Imam Waid, who's the black campus minister, the black Muslim campus minister at Duke. He's the Muslim campus minister, but he was a black Muslim, and he wanted to apply for status as a religious life group at Duke. So I said to him, have you been in campus ministry long, or is this your first time in campus ministry? And he said, no, it's my first time in campus ministry, but I feel like I've had a lot of training and experience that fits me for this. And I said, what is that? He said, well, I worked in the Black Muslim chaplaincy at the State Correctional Institution in Raleigh for 10 years. So I've worked with the incarcerated before. And I said, how do you mean? And he said, well, I worked with prisoners before, so they thought it was just a perfect fit for me to be working here at Duke with these students. And I said, wow, wait till the administration hears about that character. And then he said to me, he said, well, what's your explanation for why they drink so much on weekends? He said, I've been in jail. I've done time. You need a little help to make it through the night. And I said, well, the thing that is sad is you're not a Christian campus minister. We should be making that same. And Barth, the notion of incarceration, of imprisonment, was one he followed through his entire trajectory. And of course, his most famous, wonderful sermons is Deliverance to the Captives that he preached in jail. So Barth is really impressed that Christian freedom, he says it's the foundation for Christian ethics, the Christian life. But to say that means that it is a radically different notion of freedom than that which passes for freedom in our world.
Well, this has been fun, Will.
Thank you. Stanley, will you dismiss us in prayer? And we thank all of our participants.
I found a prayer that I'd written sometime. I'm going to pray it again because I think it's appropriate. Lord of time, we feel we live in an uncertain time, but then we are no longer sure we know what time may be. That your son ended up on a cross should have made us think twice about the assumption we know where we are in time. In the meantime, we ask for your guidance that we may know how to go on when we're not sure where we may be. We give thanks for giving us Karl Barth, whose witness stuns us, making possible a recognition that we are creatures that need one another. Draw us close to you as we are distant from one another. So drawn, may the world see that we have not been abandoned. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, everybody.